in the 13th century, a fierce warrior, Genghis Khan, organized a nearly invincible army of nomadic Mongols from Central Asia. He began the conquest of an enormous territory that would be completed by his sons and grandsons. In 1257, one grandson, Hulagu, targeted for conquest the capital of the Islamic Empire, Baghdad.
The chief religious tradition among the Mongols was various forms of shamanism. And Hulagu, at various times, mentions that one of his missions is to destroy Islam.
Hulagu demanded Baghdad's submission from the 37th Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim.
I will burn your city, your land, yourself. If you wish to spare yourself and your venerable family, give heed to my advice with the ear of intelligence. If you do not, you will see what God has willed.
The Caliph responded by saying, "You daren't attack me, because if you attack me, the entire Muslim world will come to my support." As it turned out, the Muslim world did nothing, and Baghdad faced its most terrible calamity under the Mongols.
In January 1258, Hulagu led an army of 70,000 to Baghdad. After some 30 days of fighting, Baghdad fell. And Hulagu made good on his earlier threat. He killed the Caliph by wrapping him in a rug and having him either trampled by horses or beaten to a pulp. An eyewitness recounted what Hulagu's army did next.
They swept through the city like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves. Or like raging wolves attacking sheep. With loose rein and shameless faces, murdering and spreading fear.
Probably about 100,000 people were put to the sword in several weeks of looting. The great libraries of Baghdad were intentionally destroyed. Most of their books were dumped in the river.
Legend has it that the Tigris River first ran red with blood and then black with ink.
It was a terrible massacre, and the extent of the destruction is one that remains very much in the consciousness of Iraqis today, believe it or not. For Iraqis, the very name of Hulagu brings images of destruction and fear.
Hulagu died in 1265. But his dynasty, known as the Ilkhanids, ruled the territory of Iraq, eastern Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Iran from the Iranian city of Tabriz. Damaging effects of the Mongol invasion continued to resonate in Iraq for over 2 centuries.
Iraq is a scene of devastation, constant invasions, instability, and generally economic decline. These are the dark ages of Iraq in all respects, really.
The Mongols were unable to maintain control over Iraq after the death of the last Il-Khan ruler in 1357. The region languished, mainly under a series of local strongmen, until the 16th century, when Iraq became a religious battleground between 2 neighboring empires, the Persian Safavids and the Turkic Ottomans. The Ottomans, who were Sunni Muslims, had created an empire by raiding Christian territory under Byzantine control, which they considered their duty, a jihad. The Ottomans renamed the Byzantine capital of Constantinople as Istanbul when they conquered it in 1453.
The Ottomans were the greatest military machine of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period even. They were the ones to introduce muskets for their infantry. And the Ottoman armies proved to be invincible, really.
Beginning in 1520 with the reign of the 10th Sultan, a brilliant military strategist known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached its zenith and became a world power. The Safavid dynasty was founded by Shah Ismail in 1499. The Safavid state provided the territorial and societal foundations of modern Iran.
They started out as being a mystical Muslim community in the mountains of Azerbaijan. Eventually, they would adopt Shia Islam and became fervent Shia Muslims. Under Shah Ismail, who was the first ruler of the Safavid Empire, Shia Islam was imposed upon the population of the conquered areas.
Shah Ismail invaded Iraq in 1508, in part to take control of its two holiest Shiite cities, An-Najaf and Karbala. Sultan Suleiman considered himself the supreme caliph of Islam, and so not only sought Ottoman control of Iraq for commercial reasons, but for religious ones as well.
They needed to conquer it, not only to defeat the Shi'i Persians and acquire legitimacy as Sunnis, but Iraq also represented for Suleiman the Magnificent the seat of the Abbasid Empire. For him, by conquering Iraq, he was resurrecting this Abbasid Empire. He viewed himself as the inheritor of the legacy of the Abbasids.
Suleiman began his conquest of Iraq in 1533. Surprisingly, by 1534, he captured the former Abbasid capital of Baghdad without a fight.
Baghdad surrendered quite easily to the Ottomans. Sunni scholars go out to Suleiman and they give him the keys of the city, saying, please take it over. We have been subjected to this persecution by the Safavids and we need you to take it over.
Despite Suleiman's victory in Baghdad, the Ottomans and Safavids continued to battle for control of Iraq long after the Sultan's death in 1566. The Safavids finally were driven out for good in 1638, and Iraq became part of the Ottoman Empire. But over the next 2 centuries, Suleiman's descendants found the region difficult to govern.
It was a very fractured society. Tribalism was very strong in many parts, and in fact, most people were either rural or tribal. The cities were small and few, and the Ottomans governed through a rather thin administration, mainly of Ottoman Turks, but with some Arabs as well. And it was Islam, the belief in Islam, Islamic institutions, and so on that held it together.
Early in the 19th century, the Ottomans imposed central authority over the region. They divided it into 3 administrative districts that would become the forerunner of modern Iraq: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. In fact, Basra, near Iraq's only access to the Persian Gulf, was quickly growing into a center for international trade. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottomans would have to contend with foreigners who had an eye on their wealth.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq.
In 1908, crude oil was discovered in Iran. Winston Churchill, Britain's civilian head of the Royal Navy, was convinced that oil, not coal, was the fuel of the future. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed to develop the new industry.
Everybody knew that sooner or later they were going to find oil across the border in what was then Ottoman Iraq. British investments increased, British presence increased, and already there were well-detailed plans to conquer at least the southern part of the country prior to World War I.
On August 1st, 1914, Germany, motivated by a desire for greater power and international influence, declared war on Russia. World War I was set in motion. When the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary against the Allies, the British found their commercial interests in the Middle East suddenly threatened. By November 1914, the British Army occupied Basra to defend the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's fields and refineries nearby in Iran. Beginning in 1916, the British engaged in a series of offenses that eventually led to the capture of Baghdad. They entered the city on March 11, 1917, under Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stanley Maude. 9,000 Turkish soldiers surrendered rather than put up a fight. General Maude announced to the people of Baghdad,
"Our armies do not come into your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators."
The British Army continued to move north until it captured Mosul early in November 1918. Britain then controlled nearly all of Iraq. The Ottoman Turks were defeated. Iraqis and Arabs from other Ottoman provinces in the Middle East hoped their long-held dream of self-rule would finally come true.
An Arab nationalist movement of sorts had already started before World War I. And many of the Arab army officers and civil servants and intellectuals who had been, some of them educated in Istanbul, were opposed to control by the Turks.
At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Arab hopes for independence were crushed when the Ottoman provinces were divided between France and Britain by the League of Nations. Iraq, as well as Palestine, became a mandate entrusted to Britain.
These countries were deemed to be almost ready for independence, but they were going to need help from foreign powers to prepare them for independence. Nation building, we call it today.
Arnold Wilson was the administrator in charge of the Iraq Mandate.
He argued that it was in British interest to bring civilization to Iraq, to Mesopotamia, and that this could only be done through direct English rule over the country. Thus, he brushed aside any claims of Iraqis to participate in the governance of the country.
Enraged at being shut out of the new government, 100,000 armed Iraqis revolted in July 1920.
In the Iraqi view, of course, this is the first national rebellion against British colonialism.
It took the British 3 months to crush the rebellion. By 1921, Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill was determined to end direct British rule and install a British-friendly Arab leader as King of Iraq. He invited Prince Faisal Al Hussein to become ruler of the new state, even though he was not Iraqi, but was instead a member of the Hashemites, the ruling family of Mecca.
Faisal was a descendant of the Prophet, and thus he had sort of religious credentials. He had Arab nationalist credentials in the sense that he was a leader of a revolt against the Ottomans in the name of Arabism. Generally speaking, he was considered to be quite moderate and willing to accommodate British interest.
In August 1921, Faisal was elected King of Iraq in a dubious referendum. The Hashemite monarchy was considered as foreign by many Iraqis.
The real problem here was the monarchy was seen as sort of a tool of the British, and it was the mandate itself that generated the opposition.
British control could not prevent King Faisal from leading Iraq toward greater freedom. At the king's urging, Iraq was admitted to the League of Nations as an independent state in October 1932. By the late 1940s, many Iraqis were dissatisfied with the pro-British monarchy, which was growing increasingly alienated from society.
Peasants were being driven off the land because they couldn't pay the loans that they had borrowed. So landlessness was increasing. The situation in the countryside was one of intense poverty.
Oil accentuated the class division. It had been discovered in the city of Kirkuk in 1927.
It allowed the government to enjoy a source of wealth that was not dependent on society. It didn't have to pay any attention to taxpayers and their wishes. There was the entire budget of the Iraqi government right from the ground, so it was not accountable to anybody, and this caused it to grow in arrogance and in isolation.
Inequality and social misery intensified Arab nationalist and anti-Western sentiments.
You get the rise of ideologies, and more specifically Marxism, Leninism, that begins to influence those people who are struggling against colonialism and imperial control.
The Iraqi monarchy clung to the past. On May 2nd, 1953, 18-year-old Faisal II assumed the throne.
Surrounded by senators, deputies, and members of foreign delegations, he took the oath of kingship.
In 1956, Iraq joined the Baghdad Pact, an anti-communist security alliance that included Great Britain, Turkey, Pakistan, and Iran. That same year, King Faisal affirmed his government's friendship with Britain. Two years later, the king would be assassinated.
Once you uncork the bottle, all sorts of things come out.
By the late 1950s, a strong nationalist sentiment pervaded Iraq. Determined to end the monarchy, a military group called the Free Officers Association launched a coup on July 14, 1958.
Explosive news from the Middle East. A military coup and mob revolt in Iraq topples King Faisal from the throne.
It was over in just a few hours. A bloody massacre at Al-Zuhur Palace left 23-year-old King Faisal dead.
They tore him to pieces, they mutilated his body, they cut his feet off, they cut his head off, his hands, And then they hanged him for everyone to see.
The 1958 revolution was quite violent. It wasn't meant to be. The officers that conducted it wanted to get rid of the ruling family, and the ruling family was killed. But as frequently happens, once you uncork the bottle, all sorts of things come out.
The leader of the revolution, General Abdul Karim Qasim, became Prime Minister of the new Republic of Iraq.
Our revolution is a real reaction against tyranny and corruption. Our foreign policy is to work for peace and cooperate with the other nations. We are friendly to all peace-loving nations on the basis of mutual interest.
Some of Qasim's progressive laws that promoted women's rights and land reform were considered too radical by a number of Iraqis. They began to support the right-wing Ba'ath Party that emerged in Iraq in the early 1950s.
All the forces that feared the leftist tide in Iraq gravitated toward the most militant, the most organized, the most vicious of the right-wing groups, which was the Ba'ath Party.
The storied city of Baghdad, capital of Iraq, has been the scene once more of bloody revolt that has seated a new government.
On February 8, 1963, a coalition force of Baathists and Arab nationalist army officers staged a bloody coup to overthrow Qasim. "24 hours later, he was executed. A former collaborator of Qasim in the 1958 revolution, Colonel Abdul Salam Arif, assumed the presidency. Following the coup, Arif and his Arab nationalist supporters in the army outmaneuvered the Ba'aths to take complete control of the government. But the Ba'ath Party did not go away. In fact, it grew stronger by recruiting new members and extending its reach deeper into the core of elite army officers.
The man who was responsible for doing this was Saddam Hussein, who was really responsible for organization, including not only the cell structure, but the security organization.
On April 13th, 1966, Arif was killed in a helicopter crash. He was succeeded by his brother, Abdul Rahman, a weak leader, unskilled in military politics. On July 17th, 1968, the Ba'ath Party took advantage of Abdul Rahman's ineffective leadership. The Baathists staged a nearly bloodless coup that sent him into exile. 54-year-old General Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr became president of the newly established Revolutionary Command Council, Iraq's supreme executive, legislative, and judicial body. Al-Bakr's vice chairman and second in command was 31-year-old Saddam Hussein.
He was raised by his uncle, who was a staunch Arab nationalist, and who fed him this outlook. We hear stories that he was sort of a village bully, that he carried a pistol around with him, and there are those who say he even killed someone when he was still a child.
Saddam was in charge of internal security, the job of eliminating any opposition to the Ba'ath government and to himself.
For a long time, the Ba'athists depended on elements within the military to stabilize their rule. Saddam built a new base for the party, and this was the secret police. The secret police spread an atmosphere of terror in Iraq, where everybody feared their neighbor, and even parents feared their own children.
During the next 10 years, al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein moved Iraq toward totalitarianism. After a decade of purging, power plays, and consolidation, Saddam had practical control of power within the government. Not surprisingly, al-Bakr stepped down, citing ill health. On July 17, 1979, Saddam stepped to the forefront of Iraqi politics and proclaimed himself the new leader of Iraq.
Saddam Hussein is the absolute ruler, the chief of the party as well as the state, and everything in between. And so with his unilateral rule and unilateral decision making, he really leads the country downhill.
The Iraqi troops stormed across the border and occupied the oil-rich emirate of Kuwait.
Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 brought decisive international action and led to the Gulf War in 1991. It ended in defeat and harsh, humiliating ceasefire terms for Iraq. Over the next 12 years, Iraqis endured economic sanctions, weapons inspections, and airstrikes.
Iraq under Saddam had the greatest potential. It is a very wealthy country, had a lot of resources, and it was forced to be underdeveloped economically and everything else after the sanctions were imposed after the Gulf War.
Saddam remained defiant.
This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
By 2002, many in the U.S. government believed that the Iraqi leader had hidden weapons of mass destruction somewhere in his country. A U.S.-led military coalition entered Iraq in April 2003, and before the end of the year, Saddam Hussein had been ousted and captured. Iraq has had a long tradition of violent conquest and occupation. From the era of ancient warring city-states to battles over Babylon and Baghdad, and revolt and revolution in more recent times, many have sought control of Iraq.
It's a land that historically has been very wealthy in the past, agricultural and commercial wealth, in the present oil wealth, and thus it's constantly invited invasions.
For centuries, Iraqis, indeed their Mesopotamian ancestors, resented or tolerated larger-than-life, power-hungry leaders. The end of Saddam Hussein's brutality and repression has provided an opportunity for change in Iraq. In June 2004, a new Iraqi government took control of the country. As the post-Saddam outcome for Iraq continues to unfold, the vision and leadership of Iraqis will determine how extensive change will be and what direction it will take.